Yeah, I joined the Marine Corps out of college. United States Marine Corps, commissioned in 1984 as a intelligence officer. I specialized in combat intelligence. The reason why I became an intelligence officer, of course, was the Cold War was very active at that time. I was a Russian history major. I was the child of a career military officer, and I grew up overseas in Turkey and in West Germany, the front lines of the Cold War, and I was very familiar with the threat posed by the Soviet Union to the West. And indeed, one of the reasons why I joined the military was I firmly believed that there was going to be a conflict between the United States, NATO, and the Soviet Union, and if there was, I needed to be on the front line to defend my country and our allies from the threat posed by the Soviet Union. I spent over 2.5 years training to kill Russians, and I'm not joking about that. We spent over 250 days a year in the field training with live fire ammunition under the most realistic conditions possible to close with and destroy the Russian enemy through firepower and maneuver. And I was ready to do that. And then, fortunately for me and the world, in December of 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, eliminating two categories of nuclear weapons in Europe that were pushing Europe, NATO, and the Soviet Union to the brink of war. I mean, I don't think people realize how close we were to war in the 1980s. There's echoes of that today, which we'll talk about. But because of my Russian background, I was tasked with becoming one of the first weapons inspectors sent to the Soviet Union to implement this treaty. And so I went from training to kill Russians to cooperating with them to make the world a safer place. We got rid of intermediate and short-range nuclear missiles. We made Europeans, for the first time in decades, able to go to bed at night not worrying about the imminent demise of their civilization through inadvertent nuclear war. So we were on friendly relations with the Soviet Union, on friendly relations with Russians. I lived next to a missile factory for 2 years, working with Soviet citizens, with Russians, cooperating on the disarmament of these nuclear weapons. And it was a glorious thing. And then when that, in the military, all jobs end and you move on to the next job. And I went on to get my captain's level professional education, but that was interrupted by Saddam Hussein invading Iraq. And I spent the fall of 1990 preparing for conflict with Iraq, and I deployed to the Middle East. And during the Gulf War, I was served on the staff of General Norman Schwarzkopf. I was given the counter Scud portfolio, Scud being Scud missiles. And my job was to try and find ways to interdict these missiles before they could be launched against both Israel and the Gulf Arab states. Needless to say, I and everybody else failed. The Iraqis proved to be very resolute in their efforts, but the war ended. We won. I had what they call a good war, meaning I didn't get killed, and I came out with a good professional reputation. But by the time the war ended, I was confronted with a couple things. One, the Cold War was over. That which I thought I was going to do, kill Russians, no longer applied. And I had just fought my war. I had served my country, and I felt that maybe it's time to get out of the military and move on with civilian life and see what that could offer me. But as Michael Corleone says in The Godfather, every time I try to get out, they drag me back in. And my phone rang in August of 1991. It was a colonel I worked with in the Soviet Union, and he was now the chief of staff of a United Nations organization called the United Nations Special Commission in Iraq, which was formed in the aftermath of the Gulf War to disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction capability, including the Scud missiles that I hunted. And because of my arms control experience, my intelligence experience, my experience with the Scuds, I was asked to come to the United Nations and form an intelligence capability that would enable the inspectors to uncover the lies and deceit and the concealment that Iraq was using to hide significant aspects of its weapons programs from the inspectors. Long story short, I did that job for 7 years, and very difficult job under very trying circumstances. I participated in over 40 missions inside Iraq. I led 14 of them as a chief inspector, and by the time I resigned in protest in 1998, we could account for 95% of Iraq's WMD capability. But the problem was the Security Council said that the standard was 100%. So we weren't allowed to finish our job until we could find that last 5%, which meant digging deeper, harder, working more strenuously in a confrontational manner. And the United States decided that that was inconvenient, that rather than seeking the disarmament of Iraq, they wanted the perception of Iraqi noncompliance to be continued so that they could continue economic sanctions as part of their overall program of regime change, getting rid of Saddam Hussein. My job as an inspector wasn't to get rid of Saddam Hussein, but to get rid of Saddam Hussein's weapons. So I resigned in 1998. And since that time, I've been very critical of foreign policy decisions when I view them to be not supportive of the ideals, values, and standards of the United States. Unfortunately, you recorded me in my home environment, so we get all of the wonderful sound effects that include 3 dogs barking at the neighbors when they walk by with their own animals, and there's nothing I can do to stop this. But I resigned, and I've been speaking out against bad policy ever since. I love my country. I think America is a nation of great potential. I think we have the finest document in modern civilized history in the form of the Constitution. But I think that the values and ideals that are enshrined in that document are imperfectly implemented, and I think that the role we play around the world often contravenes what we stand for as a people here at home. So I think a lot of people get confused. They say, well, you're very critical of your country. I'm critical of my country because I love my country. And I understand what my country stands for, and I want my country to be the country that it can be, not the country that it is. I think I need to touch on 3 things before we get to the actual war. One is NATO. What is NATO? NATO, of course, is a defensive alliance, ostensibly defensive alliance, whose origins date back to the end of the Second World War. And the fear among many in Europe that they needed some sort of collective security structure to hold back any potential westward expansion of the Soviet Union. This is purely fictional. The Soviets weren't planning on expanding west. Anybody who studies World War II will understand that the Soviet Union was exhausted by that conflict. Even though they were victorious, they were in no mood to continue a conflict west. They were more interested in consolidating their gains and ensuring that never again would they be threatened by a European power such as Germany, who would invade them again. So that was their focus. But Winston Churchill, of course, gave a very brilliant speech in Fulton, Missouri, I think in 1946, maybe 48. The Iron Curtain speech, and his rhetoric is wonderful. I mean, even though his the substance is fictional, the rhetoric is wonderful, and Americans, like everybody else, love a good speaker with a British accent, and we fell for it, and Europe fell for it too. They took what was supposed to be this small collective defense alliance between the Benelux nations, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, maybe Great Britain was involved, and they expanded it into NATO to bring the United States in. As Lord Ismay, the first Secretary General of NATO, famously said, what NATO was designed to keep the Russians out, keep the Americans in, and keep the Germans down. And we forget about that third part, and I'll talk about that in a minute because it's very controversial today to speak about that. To keep the Germans down. Never forget that NATO was formed only less than a decade after Nazi Germany was defeated. And when Nazi Germany was defeated, the world was struggling what to do with the Germans. Would we allow them to become an industrial nation? Would we allow them to unify? Would we allow them to exist? I mean, Germany lost the right to have a vote on that. They had endorsed the most odious ideology that the world has seen in modern times, especially, say, the Western world has seen in modern times. Nazi, National Socialism, as defined by Adolf Hitler and implemented by his henchmen. It's mind-boggling that people forget about this. But no, we created NATO, and then a few years later, we allowed Germany to enter NATO. So this defeated Nazi state, which had never been thoroughly denazified, was now militarized. And their industry was brought to bear back into the business of making weapons. Now, ostensibly in defense of Europe. NATO was a defensive alliance. And pretty much you can say that NATO lived up to its vision during the Cold War, defensive alliance. And it was very effective. I have to tell you, I lived in Germany in the 1970s and 1980s, and I saw firsthand the reality of NATO's frontline posturing. In the German villages where we lived, twice a year, the American tanks came rolling out in the farmer's field as they practiced for war. And we're talking about war on a scale that Europeans today can't imagine, even those in Ukraine. Millions of people ready to fight with the most modern weaponry possible, including nuclear weapons. Fortunately, the Cold War ended and we didn't have to have a conflict. But the question now is, what was NATO's purpose when the Soviet Union collapsed? What was the purpose of NATO? Especially given the fact that assurance has been given to Mikhail Gorbachev by the United States and other NATO members that if Germany was allowed to reunify after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward, that there would be no movement, not only into Germany, but by extension, east into any other nations that might leave the Soviet orbit. That's in keeping with the defensive alliance. But it became clear that Europe has an identity problem. And what I mean by that is, for the decades of the Cold War, Europe was completely and utterly under the umbrella of the United States defense capabilities. Yes, Britain had a nice military, the British Army on the Rhine, very professional. The Germans had their own wonderful military. The French had their military. The Dutch had their military. Everybody had their military. None of it worked without the United States. None of it worked without the United States. So now the question is, now that the Soviet threat is gone, what does Europe do? And Europe had a problem. Almost immediately after the Soviet Union collapsed, you had the Warsaw Pact. You had the Warsaw Pact collapse. You had Eastern Europe open up with great unknowns. What's going to happen? You saw potential for unrest in Romania, where Nicholas Ceausescu and his wife were gunned down in a back yard. Yugoslavia was destructing in front of your eyes with horrible civil conflict. And NATO was the only unified military structure available to Europe to deal with this. So NATO's mission changed. It became not a defensive alliance, but it became a offensively oriented security alliance, where NATO was now deployed into Yugoslavia, NATO forces. And then later on, NATO was involved in an offensive regime change oriented action against Serbia, where NATO participated in something that Europeans said they would never again do, the redrawing of the European map. One of the key aspects at the end of the Second World War is we don't mess with the maps, man. We drew the lines. We gave a chunk of Poland to Ukraine, and we gave a chunk of Germany to Poland, and now the lines are solid. We don't renegotiate. Because the second you start erasing the lines, the Germans are going to start saying, remember those Germans I told you about, that Silesia is Germany, that Prussia is Germany. Maybe we need to march, east again and take them over. It's the last thought you want to enter any German's mind. But it's the last thought you want to enter, but we did it. NATO did it in Kosovo. And since then, NATO's expanded eastward in violation of every assurance they gave to the former Soviet leaders and also to the new Russian leaders, Boris Yeltsin. The conversations between Clinton and Yeltsin are stunning to listen to how dismissive the United States is of Russian concerns about NATO expansion. That this is purely, don't worry about it. It's benevolent. We're here to do good things. Really, ask the Serbs about that. And then you have a situation where a new Russian leader comes in, Vladimir Putin, and almost immediately he reiterates, "Hey, we're not happy about this NATO expansion. This is a threat to Russia. We have to ask you, why are you expanding? If it's about European security, then let us in. Let us join. Because if we join, then we're not going to be afraid of what your real intent is. But right now it looks like you're coming right up to our borders with an aggressive, militarized alliance that has carried out regime change, not only in Serbia, where they got rid of Slobodan Milosevic, but in Libya, where they got rid of Muammar Gaddafi. I mean, this is not a defensive alliance anymore. This is an offensive-oriented alliance, and I'm a little worried Putin was thinking about the rhetoric coming out of Washington, D.C. and Europe about how maybe you don't like the fact that I'm president and you want somebody like Boris Yeltsin to be president again, a weak president, and maybe you want to put pressure on Russia to have my system collapse, remove me, and replace me. It's a little worrisome. One of the best speeches ever given in the last 3 decades was the 2007 speech given by Putin at the Munich Security Conference. Read it. Not just the speech, but the questions, the answers that he gives to the questions afterwards. He put it right on the line. This is unacceptable, this expansion of NATO. Unacceptable to Russia. We view it as a threat. And yet, what did NATO do? In 2008 in Bucharest, they offered a membership application to Ukraine and Georgia, 2 former Soviet republics. How did Russia feel about that? Well, we don't even have to ask the Russians, although we know. Why don't we ask William Burns, the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, who wrote a memorandum called Niet means Niet, no means no, in February of 2009, where he said this is a red line for Russia, and that if the United States continues to insist on NATO expansion to include Ukraine, Russia will have no choice but to go to war. This is 2009. So people need to understand that what's happening today is not something new. This isn't Vladimir Putin waking up one morning going, oh man, I'm a little irritated, I'm going to invade Ukraine. Just because. No, and it's worse. In 2014, the United States and the European Union orchestrated a regime change operation in Ukraine to get rid of the duly elected president, Yanukovych, and replace him with our boys. I'm not making this up. This is Victoria Nuland, who was at the time a senior State Department person who got on the phone and said, Yatsenko, future prime minister of Ukraine, he's our boy. And was this something that the United States was working in concert with the European Union? No. Remember what Victoria Nuland infamously said? F the EU. I won't use the real word, but F the EU. You guys know what I'm talking about. That was her dismissive attitudes towards Europe. This was an American orchestrated regime change operation in Ukraine for the sole purpose of undermining the authority and the legitimacy and the sustainability of Vladimir Putin's regime in Moscow. That's how the Russians saw it, because that's how it was. Russia's got the receipts, man. They got the intercepted conversations. They got everything. They know everything. But the West is ignorant. No. This is just sort of the expression of democracy in Ukraine. It's the people's will. Well, no, it was actually the people's will being hijacked by a very virulent, aggressive, neo-Nazi Ukrainian nationalist identity coming out of Lvov, operating under the memory of a guy named Stepan Bandera. Stepan Bandera is a Ukrainian nationalist who is operating in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. This is a guy who believes in the purity of the Ukrainian people. He cooperated with Nazi Germany during World War II. People talk about, for instance, the Babi Yar, infamous murder of 30,000 plus Jews. Ordered by the Germans, the triggermen were Ukrainians working for Stepan Bandera. People need to remember this. These aren't good people, these Ukrainian nationalists. They're Nazis. 80,000 of them joined the German forces immediately after the Germans entered. Over 250,000 ended up fighting for Germany during World War II. 250,000 Ukrainians fighting for Nazi Germany during World War II, motivated by the nationalism of Stepan Bandera. Now, when Germany lost the war, Stepan Bandera, being the Ukrainian nationalist that he is, jumped ship and went rogue, fought his own operation against now the Soviet occupiers. Who supported this? Well, during World War II, Bandera was supported by an organization, I think it was called the 12th Directorate. Basically, the German intelligence in the East, on the Eastern Front, run by a general named Gehlen. When the war ended, the Gehlen organization was taken over completely by the United States and incorporated into the CIA structure to continue anti-Soviet resistance. Nazi Germany was defeated by American troops and Soviet troops, but we took the Nazi intelligence organization in the East, made it part of our intelligence organization so we could continue to fight the Russians. And they did for 10 years with CIA funding. Over 300,000 people lost their lives in that conflict, 100,000 Poles and a lot of Russians and a lot of Ukrainians. When you say, why Poles, why Russians? Because Ukrainians are racist. Stepan Bandera is a Ukrainian nationalist who views the Poles and the Russians as subhumans, and they needed to purify Ukrainian soil from these subhuman elements. I'm not making this up. It's all documented fact. Documented fact. The atrocities that they committed are mind-boggling. But this is the ideology that moved in on the Maidan. You see, because even though they were defeated militarily around 1954, the CIA continued to fund them from 1954 to 1990. Fund their political activities, including not just the activities inside Ukraine, but also the activities of the immigrant populations that came to the United States and in Canada. So you have very strong Banderist organizations, movements in the United States and Canada, which are promoting this notion of Ukrainian nationalism, trying to clean it up, because nobody likes to admit that. You want to make make a Ukrainian uncomfortable? Ask him what Grandpa was doing between 1936 and 1954. They'll start shrugging and getting nervous because they don't want to admit Grandpa was killing Jews. Grandpa was killing Poles. Grandpa was killing Russians. Grandpa was a murderer, because that's what he was. But now they cleaned it up. It's purely Ukrainian nationalism. They got away with it from 1990 when the Soviet Union started to move on. Ukrainian independence came up until 2014. But in 2014, Ukrainian nationalism raised its ugly head. It came to the Maidan, took over a peaceful demonstration, turned it violent, evicted Yanukovych, and then used the threat of force. Even though they're a political minority, these nationalists, they were able to expand their influence through the threat of force. And they bullied their way into power. They took over the Interior Ministry. They took over the police force. They created these volunteer units of thugs who went down to Odessa, for instance, and burned to death 46 Russians, burn or smoke inhalation, that they crowded into the Union of Trade building. They went to Mariupol, where they carried out brutal street fighting against the Russian majority population there, seizing control of that city, establishing their headquarters there. That's why this Nazi movement in Germany is called the Azov Regiment. Sea of Azov is the body of water next to Mariupol. Mariupol is a Russian city, but the Azov movement, these Nazis came down and put their headquarters in Azov, basically saying, we're in control. Then they set their eyes on the Donbass. They started to make a move on Donetsk and Lugansk and the Russian populations there, who stood up and finally said enough is enough, and they started fighting. That led to 8 years of incessant warfare between the Russian, what we call separatists, because we don't want to be part of Ukraine that seeks to murder us, and Ukrainian nationalists. Now, the interesting thing is people say, well, these were volunteer units. We brought them into the military, so they're not as bad as people think. Imagine in the United States, the Ku Klux Klan, those white guys that wear the sheets and run around, burn crosses. Good people, stand-up Americans. Imagine if all the Ku Klux Klan thugs in the South got together and formed a militia battalion. And then the U.S. Army went, oh, we're just going to invite you in. We're going to bring you into the U.S. Army intact. And you get to do whatever you want to do. You can burn crosses, wear the stuff. It's okay, but now we control you. The U.S. Army just became a racist institution because it allows a racist unit inside. The Ukrainian military, by allowing the Nazi military organizations to be incorporated intact, became a Nazi unit. It's impossible to say otherwise. And now these officers are now permeate throughout the Ukrainian military. Remember, these are the frontline troops. These are the heroes. You know, they're fighting the Russians, the orcs. That's what the Ukrainians call the Russians, the orcs. You know, they're subhumans. And so this is the conflict that's going on. And now they control everything. They put pressure on Ukrainian political leaders. They put pressure on Poroshenko, the president before Zelensky, saying that if you implement policies that we disagree with, we will Maidan you. Remember that term, Maidan, Kiev? That means that you're going to ransack his office, which they did. They mean they're going to threaten to kill him, which they did. And then when he was voted out and Zelensky came in, they did the same thing to Zelensky. There's a videotape out there of a senior Azov regiment official saying that if Zelensky signs the Minsk agreements, which is the peace accord negotiated under the Normandy format with Germany, France participating, he signs it, we will hang him by the neck, kill him in the streets of Kiev. Now, normally when someone says that about a sitting president, you know, security services sweep in and remove them because they committed a crime threatening the president. No, because the security service is the Azov movement, is the neo-Nazis. And today we have a situation where Zelensky is totally under the control of this odious Nazi ideology. All of Ukraine is. They saran wrap citizens to poles, pull down their pants, beat them, paint their faces green, call them orcs. They interrogate anybody who has a Russian background. They murder many of them. They terrorize their own people. And this is who we're defending. And we're defending them because we claim that they have a right to join NATO. Really, so NATO is now going to allow a military and a nation that is imbued with Nazi ideology to join. This is insane. This is literally the definition of insanity. And yet NATO hung out the promise of membership to Ukraine. From 1914 to 2022, they trained the Ukrainian military to be a de facto proxy of NATO, provided them some of the finest military training. They had great leaders. They had great equipment. They were well organized. They were big. We're talking 160,000 active duty with up to 600, 700,000 trained reservists. This was the Ukrainian military. And what's happened to it? It's being destroyed on the battlefield as we speak. They're losing a battalion's worth of men a day. They're going to lose this war to the Russians. And yet, and the reason why is because Ukraine bought into the premise that it could join NATO, that this was a good move, that Russia wasn't serious when Russia said that eastward expansion of NATO represents an existential threat to us. So now, in the midst of this, where Russia said, and has been saying since 2009, that if you continue to push for Ukrainian membership, we will go to war. And that war will result in the dismemberment of Ukraine, the destruction of Ukraine as a modern nation state. Nobody believed Russia until now. And yet, in the midst of this, we have Finland and Sweden saying, maybe we should join NATO. I don't know how you define eastward expansion of NATO other than saying Finland joining NATO. It's to the east. It brings it right up to the Russian border. But there's a more important thing here, the history of Finland. I mean, the Finns, I'm an American. Seems to me I have a better recollection of Finnish history than maybe the Finns do. Finland used to be part of Russia. Then the Russian Revolution came. Finland fought a civil war to free itself from Russia. But there was always this tenuous relationship that Russia couldn't trust the Finns. And in 1939, Russia said, yeah, we can't trust you enough that you're too close to Leningrad. We need you to back up a little bit. So we're going to take over some of the Vyborg Peninsula, but we're going to trade you some land up here, some valuable land that has some nickel stuff that you can mine and make money. But we need to push you back from Leningrad because you're too close. And the Finns said no. So it started a war. It's the Winter War of 1939, 1940. Finns have glorified this. We won the Winter War. No, you didn't. You won the first couple months of the Winter War. Russians came in ill-prepared. They ambushed them. Winter came. But when the winter ended, Russia reorganized and kicked Finland's butt. And Finland had to sue for peace because otherwise they were going to be destroyed. Literally, they're on the cusp of losing everything, so they surrendered. Do Finns remember that? They didn't win that war. They lost that war. They had to surrender because they were about to be destroyed. And one of the things that Russia said is, we're taking the Vyborg Peninsula. It's ours because we can't trust you. You're too close to Leningrad. What did the Finns do? In 1941, they allied themselves with Nazi Germany. And they allowed Nazi Germany to use Finnish soil as a springboard to attack Leningrad, surround Leningrad, subject more than 1 million Soviet citizens to death by starvation. They allowed Finnish soil to be used as a springboard to allow German troops to attack into northern Russia to try and seize strategic ports facilities in Archangels and Murmansk, the Kola Peninsula. And they did this for 3 years. And then here's the other lesson, Finland. You lost. The Russians beat you, man. The Soviets, they crushed you. They're on the verge of just swamping through you, taking you down, absorbing you, making you disappear as a nation state, but you sued for peace. And the Soviets said, okay, if you evict the Germans, we'll come up with a negotiated treaty. So the Finns turned on their German allies, kicked them out, and then in 1949, the Soviets signed a treaty. And here's an important part of that treaty. In exchange for allowing Finland to exist as a nation state, because it should never be allowed to exist as a nation state because you fought alongside the Nazis and you killed 1 million Soviet citizens. But in exchange for letting you survive as a nation state, you have to promise to be neutral in perpetuity. I don't know what the Finnish word for perpetuity is, but in English, it means forever. Neutral forever. Now, people say, well, you can't hold Finland to that. Yes, you can, and Russia will. And it's not as though Russia's been dictating unreasonable terms. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia re-upped this treaty, Russia had no problem with Finland joining, the European Union if they wanted to. If they want to join the European Commission, if they want to be part of Europe economically, go do it. But you can never allow your soil. You can never allow your soil to be used as a potential basing point for foreign troops to threaten Russia. That's sort of a given. And if you decide you're going to do that, you lose the right to exist instantly. It's going to happen. Finland needs to understand that Russia means what it says. When Russia says no eastward expansion of NATO, that it represents an existential threat to Russia, they mean it, especially when we're talking about Finnish soil so close to Russia's #2 city, St. Petersburg. Finnish soil so close to the Kola Peninsula, which has strategic value to the Russians. They're not going to let NATO operate on Finnish soil. They're not going to let Finland become part of NATO. Is this not clear? Did Ukraine not educate anybody about anything? People say, well, wait a minute, the Russians, they're a little weak right now. They mobilized, they got their army down there in Ukraine. They can't really pull a threat. The 6th Army got pulled out of the northern military district and sent down to Ukraine. Yeah, I get it, Finland. You and your huge, massive military. That Russia is probably on the verge of declaring war in Ukraine, which then allows Putin to order general mobilization of the Russian military capability, which allows for millions of Russians now to be mobilized into the military, which means that the pathetic little Finnish military will be swamped. It ain't going to be 1939, Finland. You're not going to have some heroic resistance. Your boys ain't that tough anymore. Okay? It's not like you've raised a bunch of farm boys out there that are ready to go off and play Winter Warrior. You're like the rest of Western Europe, soft, capitalist, have a nice lifestyle, like your cell phones, like your coffee, like everything else. The Russians are going to bring some bad boys out of Siberia, and they're mad now. You want to join NATO? Bad things are going to happen. In Sweden, what do you got? 26,000 active duty troops, 40,000 reservists. Great. You can send enough guys to help fight in Finland and last a week. Last a week. That's all you would last. You got nothing. And you don't need anything. That's the beauty of it. Come on, Finland and Sweden. You guys are dealing with You have some of the greatest economies in Europe. You guys are, it's wonderful. Finland's a paradise compared to many other nations. Sweden has some problems, but they're still a paradise. One of the reasons is you don't have to divert all your resources into building a military. For what purpose? Russia does not threaten you. Russia won't threaten you. Russia doesn't view you as a threat unless you join NATO. Then you're an existential threat that has to be destroyed. This is one of the most mind-boggling things, and it scares me to death because it just seems to me that the Finnish leadership and the Swedish leadership have forgotten how to think independently. I mean, neutrality means neutral. It means you don't take sides. So when Europe's in there screaming about Ukraine, Finland and Sweden should say, we don't take any sides on this one. You know, we're sorry. That's your problem, especially when we're talking about a Ukrainian conflict, which is solely the blame for which is solely rests on the shoulders of NATO and their irresponsible expansion and their support for a neo-Nazi ideology. Now, I know that Finland has a history of Mannerheim and some right-wing movements of its own. They fought alongside the Nazis. So maybe deep down inside in the Finnish DNA, there's some sympathy for Stepan Bandera's nationalism. I'm being facetious here because I'm hoping the Finns are smarter than this. But the point is, you know, Finland should not be aligning itself with Ukraine, with the neo-Nazi ideology that resides there. Finland doesn't have to support Russia's special military operation. Indeed, Finland can speak out against it, as they should, because if you're part of the civilized world, you have to say that war is not the solution. That's just sort of a given. I mean, war only accomplishes one thing, and that's the destruction of humanity. So, Finland can be critical of the Russian actions in Ukraine, so can Sweden. But to sit there and align themselves with NATO and say that we support what the West is doing in Ukraine, so much so that we want to become part of it, it's just foolish. It's suicidal. And it makes no sense. You know, there's this notion going around about what's called the open door policy of NATO. There is no open door policy. Read the NATO charter very carefully. It doesn't have an open door policy. Just because you qualify for membership doesn't mean you get to be a member. Article 10 of the charter discusses this. It says if a nation qualifies and has submitted an application, then NATO must consider this application from the standpoint of, does it enhance the security of the organization? Pro hint, allowing Finland in, knowing Russia will attack Finland, does not enhance European security. Now, people say, well, we can't allow ourselves to be bullied by Russia. Russia's not bullying anybody. Russia says if Finland remains neutral, there's just literally no problem here. But the only thing that can stop Finnish membership, besides Finland withdrawing its application or not submitting an application, is NATO is a consensus organization. And so hopefully there will be at least one of the 30 members who will say, nah, we ain't doing that. We already got one war here on European soil. Why do we want another? And what does Finland give us? It gives us a nightmare, a lengthy border with Russia. It pretty much guarantees that we're going to go back into, at a minimum, the Cold War. Because Finland has to understand that even if Russia doesn't invade, you're going to have to militarize your whole border. You're going to have to turn it into a fortified zone. And you can't do that alone, so you're going to have to invite NATO nations. You're going to have to allow foreign troops on your soil. Is this really the future that Finland wants? I mean, it's absurd. But more importantly, is it the future that Europe wants? Can Europe afford this? Finland's joined us. I mean, this is sort of like, Finland pulling up to the Titanic after it hit the iceberg and saying, "Hey, got any room for extra passengers? Come on board." But we're sinking. NATO's going down. It's part of a Europe that can't function, cohesively anymore. People speak of NATO unity. There is no NATO unity. Poland and Hungary are almost at war with one another. Turkey doesn't want to be a part of NATO anymore. Turkey blames NATO for the conflict in Ukraine. When we get into energy policies, Slovakia and Hungary have said we're not going to participate in European sanctioning of Russian energy. Germany will die as an economy if they do this. So, is this really what Finland wants to join? Because it's not working, man. Europe's not working. And any smart European country will say the only chance we have of pulling out of this thing is to create less friction with Russia instead of more friction. So I'm hopeful that at least one nation, and hopefully more, will speak up and say, no, sorry, Finland. Europe's better off with you being neutral. Finland has to think about what it's doing. Does anybody have a thinking cap in Finland? This is the question. I don't ask this facetiously. They have a great fighter in the FA-18. And if they want to get, a better fighter, they can go out and get it. But why the F-35A? Why the F-35? It sucks as a fighter. Please, Finland, do your research. It breaks all the time. It doesn't work. It's been oversold. Thank you for supporting the American military-industrial complex. We enjoy the billions of dollars you'll be sending us, but we're giving you a piece of garbage airplane that you'll be lucky to get. 60% operational rates in peacetime, and in combat, it breaks instantly. Plus, the Russians can shoot it down because it's not as stealthy as everybody thinks it is. But what's more important about that aircraft is that it is nuclear capable. That means that it's designed to be able to deliver nuclear weapons. And NATO just did a posture review where it talks about taking U.S. B-61 nuclear bombs, which are currently stationed in Europe, and making them available to non-nuclear nations. And they're expanding this now to any nation that has the F-35A. Poland, for instance, will now become a nation that is capable of delivering American-made B-61 nuclear bombs. Wow. And Finland, when you bring in your F-35A, trust me, the first thing that NATO is going to say is you need to start cross-training your pilots to deliver nuclear weapons. Is this really the direction Finland wants to go? Because you have to understand, Finland, when you join NATO, you give up a whole bunch of sovereignty because now you're part of an alliance that's going to start dictating things to you, saying you have to do this. If you want our support, you have to do this. Right now, Russia has declared the Baltics to be a nuclear-free zone. They've respected this. Finland joins NATO and survives because, look, it's not a guarantee Russia's going to go to war against Finland. Russia's got a lot of problems of its own right now. Economic sanctions are hurting its economy. It's bitten off a lot in Ukraine. It's got to digest that first before it swallows Finland. So maybe they'll just seek to militarize for the moment. But part of that militarization will be the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons throughout the area. And every Finnish city will now be targeted with a nuclear weapon or two or three or four or a dozen. Okay, so Finland, you do now know that if there is a war with Russia that begins, for instance, in Moldova, are the Finns ready to die for Transnistria? It's just a question I want to ask the average Finn. I'd love to walk in Helsinki. You ready to die for Transnistria? Because you're going to. You're going to die because when that goes to war and then the Romanians attack and then the Russians counterattack, the Americans send in a brigade, it gets annihilated. So the Americans use a tactical nuke. Boom, 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 boom. It's all over. Helsinki disappears in a cloud of radioactive dust. That quick. 200,000 degrees suntan. I know you guys like your sun, but you're going to get a big tan. You're going to burn to death. You're going to fry because the Russians are going to nuke you automatically. It doesn't matter anymore that, you're Finland and you're not that, you have nothing to do with Moldova. You're part of NATO. Therefore, you're now part of the target package, man. And when the Russians start pushing the buttons, target package is all inclusive. It doesn't prejudice against anybody. So every Finn will die. Every Finn will die. That's your future. There's no other future. It doesn't get better than this. It only gets worse. Joining NATO is a suicide pill. Either short term with a mercifully bloody Russian invasion, but at least Helsinki still survives. The Finns still live. Or long term with thermonuclear holocaust that kills everybody. That's Finland's future. Literally, that's your future. There is no other outcome. NATO is not going to prevail. NATO is collapsing. And the best that Finland can hope for is to remain neutral, stay above the fray, survive. I just would ask, the people who see this to sit back and reflect on the life they have now, and look around and see how wonderfully simple it is comparatively. How little they spend on defense, because there's no need to spend a great deal of money on defense. And how the luxury of life, because that will all come to an end the moment you join NATO. Whatever you think NATO is going to bring, it isn't going to bring. The life you enjoy today is not going to get better. It's going to get much worse. Your money, you're going to be spending money on defense that doesn't need to be spent. You're going to be asked to do things from a defense standpoint that you never would have considered before. And people need to really sit back and say, if I enjoy the standard of living that I have now, and I want the standard of living for my children and my grandchildren, then joining NATO is not the path. You're just guaranteeing that your grandchildren, if they're alive at all, will live in a regime of fear, because the Cold War, I'm just here to remind you, I lived in West Germany during the Cold War. It was an atmosphere of prevalent fear. Every day we had to worry about Soviet troops coming over the border. I lived next door to a nuclear storage facility, North Point, which would have been one of the first places struck. So when you went to bed at night, were some generals going to make a decision that resulted in a tactical nuclear weapon hitting North Point so I would never wake up in the morning? When I got on the school bus and went to school, was I going to be able to come home to a place, or was some Soviet missile going to hit it? This was a daily existence. And if that's the future you want, to be worrying about whether or not you're going to live to see the morning, join NATO. Be my guest. But if not, you guys are ostensible democracies. Act like it. Hold your elected representatives accountable. If they don't want to hold a referendum, hold one for them, called a recall vote. Get them out of office. Put people in who respect democracy. Put people in who will listen to you. Now, the Finnish people may come out and say, hey, Ritter, thanks, but we still want to join NATO. That's okay. That's your decision. You're a democracy. Do what you want to do. But don't allow your government to make a decision for you of this magnitude without you having the ability to weigh in. That's the important thing. You're giving up everything when you do that.